The County Transportation Department first noticed the discrepancy during a routine roadside asset inspection along the eastern agricultural corridor outside the town limits. Crews had been assigned to verify highway signage ahead of scheduled resurfacing work. Among the checkpoints was a standard green directional sign positioned along the two-lane state highway, Riverton, 12 miles. By every record in the roadway registry, the sign had been installed 16 years earlier and had never been moved. Yet the inspection vehicle's distance counter reached Riverton roughly 2 miles sooner than the sign indicated. At first, the discrepancy seemed trivial. Vehicle odometers vary, tire diameter changes slightly with temperature, even pavement wear can introduce small deviations in measured distance. The inspector logged the difference as a possible calibration error and continued the survey. The following morning, another crew drove the same segment. This time, the counter reached Riverton nearly 3 miles sooner than expected. The sign still read 12 miles, and it remained anchored in the same location. The resurfacing schedule required precise measurement of roadway segments, so the discrepancy triggered a second verification. Survey engineers returned with calibrated distance wheels normally used for lane marking projects. The measurement began directly beneath the signpost, with the wheel rolling along the shoulder while a second technician recorded the count. The wheel stopped at the Riverton City boundary marker. The distance read 10.9 miles. The sign behind them still displayed 12. At that stage, the issue appeared administrative rather than physical. Signage errors happen occasionally when highway segments are redesigned or city boundaries shift. A simple registry check would normally resolve the matter. But the archival map showed the same number. 12 miles. The city limits marker had not moved since the highway was constructed. And the sign's installation coordinates matched the original engineering drawings exactly. The discrepancy should have been constant. Instead, the next morning, it changed again. Another measurement run produced 9.7 miles. Nothing about the road itself had altered overnight. The asphalt was continuous, the shoulder intact, the drainage ditches unchanged. Survey stakes placed during resurfacing planning still marked the pavement edges at fixed intervals. Yet the physical distance between the sign and Riverton had decreased by more than 2 miles since the first inspection. The road had not shortened, but the distance between the sign and the town clearly had. Transportation engineers initially assumed an error in the wheel measurement, so the corridor was resurveyed using GPS-based roadway mapping equipment mounted on a highway maintenance truck. The system calculated distance through satellite triangulation rather than ground contact. Its result differed from the previous day as well. 8.6 miles. The truck had traveled the entire stretch without interruption. The odometer reading confirmed it. The road itself still existed, but the measured interval between the sign and Riverton was steadily decreasing. That contradiction introduced the first operational concern. Highway signage is legally regulated because emergency services depend on it. Ambulances and fire vehicles calculate response routes using standardized distance markers. A 2-mile discrepancy might cause minor delays. A 4-mile discrepancy could affect fuel calculations for heavy equipment responding from neighboring counties. If the measurement drift continued, the sign could eventually display a distance that no longer corresponded to the physical highway at all. The Transportation Office scheduled a full corridor verification. Aerial imaging from a survey drone produced an unexpected confirmation. The highway alignment had not changed. The asphalt ribbon connecting the farmland to Riverton traced the same straight line it had followed for decades. However, the drone's onboard mapping software calculated the Riverton boundary at 8.4 miles from the signpost. Within a week, 5 separate measurement methods had produced 5 different distances. Every result was shorter than the one before. That pattern forced a broader examination of the corridor itself. Roadside drainage channels were the first environmental feature checked. If erosion had altered the shoulder alignment or collapsed sections of pavement, the road could theoretically shorten by cutting across previously unused ground. But the drainage channels remained intact. Field fencing along both sides of the highway, still connected to the same wooden posts installed years earlier. And the telephone poles lining the road had not shifted position. Their spacing matched the original utility installation map exactly, 40 meters apart. If the road had physically shortened, the poles would have moved closer together. They had not. Yet when the next survey run beg, and at the signpost and ended at the city boundary marker, the distance had decreased again. 7.9 miles. The asphalt surface still extended the full length of the highway. Drivers still traveled the entire route. But the interval between those 2 fixed points continued to compress. At this stage, one junior analyst proposed that Riverton's city boundary marker might have been relocated during municipal maintenance without notifying the highway department. The suggestion seemed plausible until the town's public works office confirmed the boundary monument had never been moved. The concrete base had been poured directly into bedrock when the highway was constructed. Relocation would have required excavation equipment and a multi-day closure of the road. No such operation had occurred. That explanation collapsed. What remained was harder to categorize. The distance between 2 stationary points was shrinking without any visible change to the ground separating them. Field engineers returned to the site before sunrise to repeat the measurement again. Morning fog had settled along the agricultural corridor, dampening the surrounding fields and softening the edges of the roadway. The measurement wheel rolled steadily along the shoulder. The technicians expected another reduction. Instead, they encountered something else. The wheel slowed, not because the surface changed, because the air itself seemed thicker. The resistance appeared suddenly about a mile down the road from the sign. Walking forward required slightly more effort, as though the space along that stretch of highway had become denser than the surrounding atmosphere. The effect extended across the full width of the road. Beyond that point, the resistance disappeared. The remainder of the highway felt normal. The measurement finished at 7.8 miles. That was when the first pattern emerged. Each morning, the compressed distance began at the signpost and extended outward along the highway. And each day, the region of compression expanded farther toward Riverton. The environment between those 2 points was gradually changing. Not visibly, but measurably. A review of weather station data revealed another detail that had gone unnoticed during the early inspections. Wind passing across the highway corridor slowed sharply within the same stretch, where the technicians reported increased walking resistance. Outside the region, wind speeds matched the surrounding farmland. Inside it, airflow dropped to nearly zero. Air was entering the corridor, but it was not moving through it. That suppression had a secondary consequence. Dust from passing vehicles remained suspended longer than normal. The particles drifted slowly forward along the road, as though encountering invisible drag. The effect was subtle. Drivers rarely noticed it, but measurement instruments recorded it clearly. Something along the highway was altering the behavior of the air itself. The suppression zone originated at the road sign, and it was spreading. By the 10th day, the compressed distance measured 6.3 miles. Riverton had not moved. The road had not changed. But the environmental behavior between those 2 points continued to contract the measurable space separating them. Local drivers began noticing a separate phenomenon. Trips into town seemed shorter in the morning. The same drive home in the evening felt longer. Most people assumed traffic patterns had changed. No one initially connected the experience to the sign. The transportation office did, because the compression only appeared overnight. Every morning, the distance between the sign and Riverton decreased slightly more. And every evening, the corridor returned to normal atmospheric behavior. The sign still read 12 miles, but the region of environmental suppression beneath it was now halfway to the town, and still expanding. By the time the anomaly reached the 7th mile marker, the corridor intersected with something far more critical than farmland. The highway crossed the eastern feeder route, supplying freight trucks to the Riverton Rail interchange. Heavy cargo vehicles began reporting unusual fuel consumption along that segment of road. Engines were working harder to maintain speed, as if the air ahead of them resisted forward movement. The freight corridor had entered the suppression zone, and the zone was still growing. By the time the phenomenon reached the freight junction, the highway department had already installed continuous atmospheric sensors along the affected stretch of road. The instruments confirmed what drivers had begun describing informally. The corridor between the sign and Riverton behaved like a region where air movement gradually slowed to near immobility. Wind entering the zone diminished until it nearly stopped. Vehicles moving through it encountered a subtle but measurable drag, similar to driving against a steady headwind. Yet weather stations surrounding the corridor reported completely normal atmospheric conditions. The effect existed only within the precise line of highway connecting the signpost to the town. Even more unusual, the suppression field expanded overnight and weakened again during daylight hours. Morning measurements consistently showed the compressed distance increasing toward Riverton. By afternoon, the air along the corridor returned almost to normal. That cycle introduced the first temporary investigative dead end. Engineers briefly suspected a temperature inversion forming along the asphalt surface during nighttime cooling. Under certain conditions, denser air can trap wind near ground level and produce localized stagnation. But temperature sensors placed along the corridor revealed no such inversion. The suppression occurred regardless of overnight temperature. The air simply slowed, and it slowed within boundaries that matched the highway itself with unusual precision. The farmland on either side remained unaffected. Wind turbines operating in adjacent fields continued spinning normally, while the roadway beneath them experienced near-still air. The suppression followed the pavement exactly. During the 12th day of monitoring, a second environmental consequence appeared. Sound began to behave differently inside the corridor. Traffic noise dissipated more quickly than expected, as if the air absorbed acoustic energy before it could travel far. Drivers standing beside the road noticed that passing trucks seemed unusually quiet once they moved a short distance away. Acoustic meters confirmed a measurable reduction in sound propagation within the suppression zone. The air inside the corridor dampened vibration. That discovery created an unexpected operational concern. Several miles ahead of the expanding zone, the highway passed beneath Riverton's Eastern Rail overpass, a reinforced steel structure carrying freight trains between the interchange yard and the national rail network. Engineers monitoring the bridge had previously documented subtle vibration patterns caused by heavy trucks crossing the roadway below. Those vibrations were part of the structural health model used to detect early fatigue in the bridge supports. When the suppression field approached the overpass, the sensors began reporting weaker vibration signatures. At first, the change appeared beneficial. Reduced vibration might extend the structure's lifespan. But the pattern continued shifting. The acoustic dampening reduced the bridge's monitoring sensitivity. If structural fatigue began developing, the suppression field could mask the early warning signals. The anomaly had now intersected with critical infrastructure. A decision was made to track the suppression boundary more closely. Every morning, the zone extended farther down the road. Every afternoon, it weakened. The distance between the sign and Riverton continued to decrease during each overnight expansion. 5.1 miles, then 4.4 miles. Yet the physical highway still occupied its full length. Vehicles still traveled the same route. The environment between those 2 points was simply behaving as though the air itself resisted motion. During the 17th day, a freight driver inadvertently provided the most revealing observation. He entered the corridor shortly before sunrise while hauling a refrigerated trailer toward the rail yard. As the truck approached the suppression boundary, the vehicle's onboard air pressure sensors recorded a slight increase in engine load. That part was expected. What drew attention later was the driver's description of the road sign as he passed it. He reported that the sign appeared closer than usual when approaching from the opposite direction. The statement sounded like ordinary perception error until the morning survey team repeated their measurement from the Riverton side. The result revealed something new. The suppression field did not simply expand outward from the sign. It also appeared to anchor itself to the signpost. Approaching from Riverton, technicians encountered the same region of slowed air roughly halfway along the highway. Beyond that point, conditions returned to normal until they reached the sign itself. The field was centered on the sign, and it extended outward along the road toward both directions. That meant the measured distance between the sign and Riverton was not shrinking because the town was moving closer. The suppression zone itself was compressing the measurable environment around the sign. Inside the zone, motion, including the movement of air, sound, and vehicles, progressed more slowly relative to the surrounding environment. Distance measurements conducted inside the field therefore accumulated less travel before reaching the town boundary. The road had not shortened. Movement within the corridor had. The implication explained the daily distance reduction. Each morning, the suppression zone expanded farther outward from the sign, increasing the portion of highway wear. Movement slowed. Each evening, the field weakened, allowing air and traffic to move normally again. But the overnight expansion resumed the following day. The sign had effectively become the center of a region where environmental motion gradually decelerated. Why that location had triggered the effect remained unknown. The sign itself was examined for unusual materials, electromagnetic emissions, or structural alterations. None were found. It remained a standard aluminium highway marker mounted on a galvanized steel post. Yet the suppression field continued growing. By the 23rd morning, the compressed distance between the sign and Riverton measured 2.9 miles. Freight trucks traveling toward the rail interchange now experienced measurable drag for nearly the entire corridor. Fuel consumption along the route increased enough for the logistics companies operating the freight line to request a formal explanation from the State Transportation Authority. No explanation could be provided. The road surface remained unchanged. The sign remained stationary. But the environmental behavior surrounding it continued to alter the way motion occurred along the highway. One additional anomaly appeared shortly afterward. The boundary of the suppression zone stopped expanding. It stabilized just before reaching the Riverton rail overpass. Morning measurements remained consistent for several days. The compressed distance fluctuated slightly but no longer advanced toward the town. The field had reached a fixed radius centered on the sign. That stabilization introduced another brief analytical disagreement inside the transportation office. Some engineers argued the anomaly might eventually dissipate now that it had stopped growing. Others suggested the boundary had simply reached an equilibrium. The following week settled the debate. The suppression field persisted. Each morning, the compressed distance reappeared. Each evening, the corridor returned almost to normal atmospheric behavior. The cycle repeated with remarkable consistency. Freight companies adjusted their route calculations to account for the increased engine load within the corridor. Bridge monitoring protocols were modified to compensate for acoustic dampening near the overpass. And the road sign itself was added to a permanent inspection schedule. The sign still reads Riverton, 12 miles. Drivers traveling the highway at sunrise continue reaching the town far sooner than that distance would suggest. Later in the day, the drive returns to its expected length. No visible boundary marks the suppression zone. Wind turbines still rotate in the surrounding fields. Crops move normally in the breeze. But along the exact line of pavement where the sign stands, motion continues to behave differently each morning. The environment slows. Airflow fades. Sound softens. And the measurable space between the sign and Riverton contracts again, just enough to remind the transportation office that the highway still passes through a region where movement does not follow the same rules as the surrounding world.